It seems like an understatement to say, but James Hunt was a controversial man. After bursting onto the scene in 1973, he made a name for himself by crashing, punching, womanizing, and winning.
James Hunt crosses the line to win the British Grand Prix.
This video will take a look at the story of Hunt's short Formula 1 career, as well as the highlights from his junior career and post F1 endeavours. Let's run through his 15 greatest moments, and remember, the name's Hunt, James Hunt. In 1967, James Hunt drove his very first motor race in a snazzy little Mini, which I think is pictured here, although I have to be honest and say that there was only one source which claimed to have a picture of James racing a Mini, so this might be someone else entirely. He then moved up to Formula Ford in 1968, driving a Russell Alexis Mark XIV, which once again proved almost impossible to find a picture of. Nevertheless, it was in this car where he tasted success for the first time, taking his very first ever car racing victory at Liddon Hill, a track famous for rallycross. He also set the lap record on the short circuit at Brands Hatch that year, demonstrating for the first time that he had talent as well as enthusiasm. Just to briefly summarise the rest of James's junior career, he raced in European Formula Ford in 1969, British Formula 3 and saloon cars in 1970, British Formula 3 again in 1971, and European and British Formula 2 in 1972. At all of these levels he had some degree of success, but he also began to develop a reputation for being a little bit feisty, earning the nickname Hunt the Shunt. It's estimated that in his first 5 years of driving, James totaled over 10 cars, causing him to run constantly low on money. However, with backing from various sponsors such as Gowrings of Reading, Coca-Cola and a certain Lord Hesketh, James continued to climb the ranks until 1973, when Hesketh bought a March 731 Formula 1 car, installing Hunt as its one and only driver. James was, quite literally, off to the races. Hunt made his F1 debut at the daunting Monaco Street Circuit in 1973, where he was only half a second off the factory march in qualifying. He then ran well for most of the race, but unfortunately his engine failed 5 laps from the end and he was classified 9th, which back in those days earned you 0 points. Unperturbed, James returned for the French Grand Prix, where he climbed his way right up to 6th place from 14th on the grid and scored his very first F1 point in just his second race. I actually covered this race for Random F1 Race Reviews, and I was disappointed by how little we saw of James on the official broadcast for the Grand Prix, although I guess that's 1970s TV direction for you. James then went not just 1, but 2 places better in Silverstone, surviving a massive pile-up and red flag, and then chasing the podium places hard, ultimately finishing just 3.4 seconds behind eventual winner Peter Revson in 4th place. The 1973 Dutch Grand Prix was a tragic race, and I will not be playing any footage from that Grand Prix out of respect for Roger Williamson, who died that day in a brutal and needless fire. However, this race still warrants a mention when discussing the career of James Hunt, who caught and passed Peter Revson's McLaren on his way to 3rd place and his first proper F1 podium. For the pedants out there, it's worth bringing up that James technically had an F1 podium by this time already, having finished 3rd at the Race of Champions at Brands Hatch, but that was a non-championship event with a less competitive field than the World Championship, so I elected not to include that on this list. There was yet more tragedy at the US Grand Prix, as Francois Sever died in a crash during qualifying, showing yet again just how dangerous it was to be an F1 driver in the 70s. Yet again though, this race has to be mentioned in the context of James Hunt's career, as this was the day where he finished just 0.7 of a second behind Ronnie Peterson's Lotus, very nearly winning the Grand Prix in what was still just a privateer march. Up until this point, Hesketh Racing had been seen as a bit of a party team, full of affluent young men drinking wine and wooing girls, but with James Hunt and a strong team of mechanics they proved that they could pedal a car too. As I previously mentioned, F1 used to have non-championship events where races will run to F1 regulations despite not counting towards the World Championship. One of the most prestigious of these was the BRDC International Trophy, and in 1974 James Hunt put on the drive of his life. After starting on pole position, James inexplicably dropped down the order, and it would later turn out that his gear knob had sheared clean off. Gripped by determination, James adapted to driving the car by the stick of the gear lever itself, which must have been absolutely excruciating for the best part of an hour. Unbelievably, he was just as fast as ever, and he ended up climbing back through the field before going on to win by 37 seconds. An outstanding performance, and his first victory in F1 machinery. Despite some promising performances in the brand new Hesketh 308, James would have to wait over a year for his first World Championship victory, which would come in famous circumstances at the Dutch Grand Prix. After starting third on the grid in greasy conditions, James changed early onto dry tyres, putting him into the lead when the track dried up. He then just needed to keep to the racing line to win, and not even a charging Niki Lauda could pass him. It was one of F1's first truly memorable battles for a win, and one that would go down in history as the true start of the Hunt-Lauda rivalry. After the race, Hesketh put this win down to getting the setup just right for the conditions, but they also acknowledged James Hunt's superb ability not to crack under pressure. James and Hesketh ended 1975 in 4th place in the World Championship standings. When Emerson Fittipaldi controversially left McLaren to drive for the Fittipaldi team, and Lord Hesketh simultaneously took a step back from his own team, it only seemed logical that James Hunt should drive for McLaren, and so, for 1976, the M23 had a new star pilot. Having first debuted in 1973, the McLaren M23 wasn't exactly a new car, but consistent upgrades kept it competitive even against the likes of Ferrari and Tyrrell, who were stepping up their game all the time. James immediately took his first pole position at the Brazilian Grand Prix, but he ended up crashing out due to a stuck throttle. The Spanish Grand Prix would be more successful though, as he took pole again by 0.3 of a second, although he lost the lead to Lauda at the start. After following the Ferrari for 31 laps, Hunt finally found a way through and then went on to win by over half a minute, but any of you who know the story of the 1976 season know it wasn't over yet, oh no. Immediately following the race, the scrutineers found James's car to be 1.5 centimetres too wide, and he was disqualified. This was allegedly due to Goodyear's new tyres, which were slightly wider than the previous generation, and which McLaren hadn't factored into their car's design. McLaren appealed the decision, stating that 1.5 centimetres was a minimal infraction and that it wasn't worth a disqualification, and after having to wait 2 months for a decision, their appeal was upheld. James Hunt was reinstated as the winner, which was ultimately crucial in deciding the outcome of the World Championship. Despite not being important in the context of the World Championship, James's win at the 1976 BRDC International Trophy still warrants mention due to just how utterly dominant it was. In front of his home crowd at Silverstone, James took pole position by over 0.8 of a second, and then controlled the race on his way to an 11-second victory. The field was also significantly more competitive than it was the last time he had won this race, containing several factory teams such as March and Tyrrell. It was a hat-trick for Hunt, as he also took fastest lap. After a win in France and a famous disqualification in Britain, Hunt and the rest of the F1 circus went to the Nürburgring in Germany. The 1976 German Grand Prix is of course most well known for Niki Lauda's fiery crash and subsequent recovery, but it should also be remembered for what it was, possibly the most dangerous Grand Prix in history. Seriously, by this point there is no way that F1 should still have been racing on this circuit. The cars had dramatically outgrown the track, and the drivers' concerns were not being listened to at all. Surviving this Grand Prix deserves a lot of credit, let alone winning the thing, and ultimately it was James Hunt who won the final Grand Prix at the Nordschleife by an impressive 28 seconds. James then went on to win the Dutch, Canadian and US Grand Prix, and although Lauda made a legendary comeback to set up a championship showdown in Japan, the Ferrari driver pulled out of the race in the treacherous conditions, leaving James Hunt to become world champion. In my opinion, both Lauda and Hunt deserved the championship that year, and I'm so glad this tremendous story got the recognition it deserved in the 2013 movie Rush, which is definitely worth seeing if you haven't already. After the glory of his World Championship winning year, James's 1977 didn't get off to the best of starts, with only 2 podiums from the first 9 races. However, this didn't stop a record crowd from turning up to Silverstone to support their hero, and James would have been determined to put on a show. In qualifying, he took yet another pole position at the circuit where he'd had so much success already, but at the start he had a clutch problem which dropped him to 4th. Despite this, he then repassed Lauda and Scheckter, and then eventually John Watson, who had been leading for Brabham. James was then unchallenged, and when Watson dropped out due to an issue with his fuel system, James's winning margin became 18 seconds over his arch-rival Lauda. Following another pole position, this time at the US Grand Prix, Hunt yet again had the weather to deal with as race day was wet and dreary. Once again, Hunt had a suboptimal start, dropping behind Hans-Joachim Stuck's Brabham, but when Stuck made a mistake while changing gears and spun off, it was James's turn to lead. After this, the track began to dry, but not sufficiently enough that it was worth pitting for slicks, and so then the race became about preserving the tyres without losing too much time. The driver who seemed to do this the best was Mario Andretti, who caught to within 2 seconds of Hunt going on to the final lap. Frantically, the mechanics on the pit wall signalled to Hunt that the Lotus was right behind him, and James was able to squeeze one last burst of pace out of his tyres in order to finish first, just 2 seconds ahead of Andretti. Hunt may not have won the championship in 1977, but he still won big in Japan. After qualifying second behind Andretti, James jumped ahead of the Lotus driver at the start and then led every single lap, absolutely dominating at the track where he'd won the championship a year earlier. Admittedly, this win was helped by Lauda's decision not to run the race, as he had already wrapped up the title, but even so, credit where credit's due. Not everyone can say they won a Grand Prix by over a minute. I do of course have to mention that this Grand Prix was another tragic one, as Lauda's replacement Gilles Villeneuve launched over the wall after a collision with another car, killing Marshal Kengo Yuasa and photographer Katsuhiro Ohashi. The 1970s were a brutal time for Formula One. This would actually be James's last win in F1, as in 1978 the McLaren was thoroughly beaten by the more technically advanced cars of Brabham, Ferrari, Tyrrell and especially Lotus. Hunt would then do just 7 races for Wolff before retiring from Formula One in 1979. His career had been short but sweet, and in 92 starts he had achieved 10 wins, 14 pole positions and 23 podiums, as well as the World Championship of 1976. Shortly after retiring from Formula One, James swapped the cockpit for the commentary box, joining Murray Walker for live Grand Prix coverage. Back in the early 1980s, the BBC had only just begun showing every race live, and James and Murray helped to introduce a brand new generation of fans to the sport. Fans would tune in for F1's excitement and Murray's enthusiasm, but it was often James who left an impression thanks to his outspokenness and his blunt line deliveries. Some of my favourite quotes include the following.
Fokker have always been terribly easily seduced by the idea of going to America, and I can't understand why the people in Detroit haven't found a green field just outside and built a proper racetrack. I think that's Honda giving us a load of BS, as they say.
It looks to me that certainly at some circuits, that the only difference between them and the McLaren Honda is the contents of the cockpit.
And of course, sometimes he could just be downright savage. Here's what he had to say about some of the drivers.
He should know he's there, he's leading the race, and look at this idiot.
That's the Lola Lamborghini of Alio, looking to be having his usual accident.
These normally aspirated engine cars are a very different kettle of fish to drive, he says.
And all I can say to that is bullshit.
As you've probably already gathered, James was a rather outspoken individual who did not care to disguise his feelings about things that mattered to him. He spoke out against both FISA and FOCA, the two dueling governing bodies of the sport. He spoke out against FIA President Jean-Marie Balestre, against decisions he felt were unfair, and he even spoke out against apartheid in South Africa. Despite his flaws, in my opinion, James was a gentleman, and it would be utterly fascinating to hear what he'd have to say about the modern world. Sadly, we never got a chance to find out. As a racing driver in the 60s and 70s, James was in danger 100% of the time. So far in this video, I've mentioned the tragic deaths of Roger Williamson, Francois Sever and 2 bystanders, but these were far from the only ones, as the cars were faster than ever before and with almost no thought to track safety. In 1978, James was involved in the horrific crash which would ultimately end the life of Ronnie Peterson, a man who James had the utmost respect for, and it must have taken every ounce of courage in his heart to put himself back in the car and race again. Despite the crashy tendencies of James's early days in the sport, Hunt never seemed to put another driver in danger in Formula 1, seeming to mature and understand the risks of the sport. Despite surviving his career, James ultimately died of a heart attack aged just 45. Rest in peace, James Simon Wallace Hunt.